Christopher Nolan's 2017 war epic Dunkirk tells the story of the mass evacuation of British and French troops from Dunkirk, France between May 26th and June 4th, 1940. Over the course of those 9 days, over 330,000 Allied troops were rescued and shipped across the Channel to England, all while enemy forces surrounded them on land and attacked from the air. The miraculous rescue mission was a success thanks in large part to the British civilians who, when called upon, put their own lives at risk to sail across the Channel and help with the evacuation. Despite the significant losses, Dunkirk nevertheless demonstrated the courageous spirit of the British people in the face of great adversity. It's a harrowing, yet inspirational film. But is Dunkirk historically accurate? Let's find out what the really happened to Dunkirk. While Dunkirk has been praised for its stunning filmmaking and unique structure, the story is about as bare bones as it gets. With sparse dialogue and very little historical context, Nolan clearly sought to highlight the experience over a traditional narrative story. It's an effective filmmaking decision, but for our purposes here, some background information is necessary to help separate fact from fiction. A total and thorough breakdown of everything would be far too complex for this video, so here's the abridged version. After Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939, the United Kingdom sent the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, to aid in France's defense. After 8 months of relatively little fighting, known as the Phony War, Germany launched a massive invasion of both Belgium and the Netherlands in May 1940. Easily overpowering Dutch and Belgian forces. German troops then moved into France, surpassing both the Maginot Line and the heavily wooded Ardennes region, both essential aspects of the French defensive line. With French forces and reserves quickly dwindling, and German troops moving deeper into the territory, Britain felt their only option was an armed retreat. On May 20th, Churchill began planning Operation Dynamo, which would oversee the rapid evacuation of as many British troops as humanly possible from Dunkirk beach. Early estimates were grim, with Churchill believing they'd only be able to save a fraction of nearly 400,000 soldiers stranded on the beach. With Germans closing in on all sides, and even from above, the stage was set for a potentially disastrous outcome. Right off the bat, it's important to mention that Nolan never intended for his film to be a literal retelling of the operation. But while all the characters are fictional, Nolan says the bigger movements portrayed are entirely accurate. And to add to the film's realism, Nolan opted to film on location at Dunkirk. The movie picks up during the early days of the evacuation, and is broken into 3 interconnected threads, each story focusing on a different aspect of the mission. The film opens with The Mole, which follows the desperate soldiers stranded on the beach. The Mole refers to the massive stone pier that serves as the only viable boarding zone for the larger ships. In reality, there were 2 moles, both east and west, but the film only shows one. Tommy, played by Finn Whitehead, is one of our protagonists. We first see him and his patrol as they make their way through an abandoned town square just outside the beach. German propaganda flyers rain down from the sky, professing the futility of continued Allied efforts. In reality, the German forces actually did print thousands of flyers, which they dropped from planes over Dunkirk in an effort to demoralize Allied soldiers. But these flyers weren't as colorful as the ones in the film. After barely surviving the ambush, Tommy makes his way past a fortified French barricade and finds his way onto the beach, which is populated by thousands of soldiers awaiting evac. It's here where he meets Gibson, who is presently burying a body. Soon after, German dive bombers drop from the sky and litter the beach with bombs, killing many and injuring more. In real life, these surprise Luftwaffe attacks were an all too common occurrence. With limited defense capabilities and nowhere to go, these soldiers were sitting ducks. The horrifying, screeching sound of the descending bombers was a precursor to certain devastation, and there was very little these men could do about it. Following the attack, Tommy and Gibson find an injured soldier and hurry him to a departing hospital ship, hoping to secure a spot for themselves as well. Ultimately, they're kicked off, but in the process the ship is attacked by more German dive bombers and sunk. While it's never explicitly stated in the movie, the ship could very well be the HMHS Paris, a British hospital ship sunk off the coast of Dunkirk by German bombers on June 2nd, 1940. Just before this second bombing, we're introduced to Commander Bolton, played by Kenneth Branagh. Bolton is a fictional character, but is most likely inspired by the real-life captain William Tennant, who is at Dunkirk and credited as an essential part of the hectic evacuation process. The commander meets with two other high-profile British admirals, where he is informed that Churchill is restricting access to more planes and ships for the sake of defending Britain when the war inevitably comes home to them. Furthermore, Churchill only anticipates that he'll be able to rescue around 45,000 of the nearly 400,000 soldiers stranded at Dunkirk, and gives immediate orders to his captains to deny Frenchmen from boarding the ships. To further help with the mission, the Navy had enlisted British civilians to help with the rescue effort. All of this information is accurate. However, it's worth noting that Churchill never explicitly demanded the exclusion of French soldiers, but high-ranking officials at Dunkirk, like Bolton and the Admiral, made efforts to prioritize British troops, mainly because the French army was in total disarray. Churchill actually supported the French rescue, believing that it would strengthen their morale. Eventually, the French were taken aboard, and by the end of 9 days, over 75,000 French soldiers were saved. Following the second dive-bombing attack, Bolton helps Tommy. Meanwhile, Gibson and the recently rescued Alex board a second ship, a British destroyer. While Tommy and Alex head to the mess hall, Gibson, who we'll soon learn is actually a French soldier trying to escape, remains on the top deck, afraid to give himself away. Knowledgeable war historians may realize the British destroyer seen here isn't British at all, but rather French. Nolan had his hands tied here, as functional destroyers are hard to come by, so he was forced to use a French model from the 1950s. Someone with a keen eye and knowledge of the ships will notice the destroyer in the film is larger and longer than British models, but Nolan dressed the ship to make it look more period accurate. As he puts it, the veracity of being on board a real boat in real water trumped the historical accuracy of making a perfect computer graphic model. The destroyer sets sail across the channel, but soon becomes the target of a German U-boat and is sunk by a torpedo. What results is one of the more intense sequences of the movie, with young soldiers desperately scrambling to escape the flooding ship. In total, 9 destroyers were, well, destroyed over the course of 9 days. 6 of them were British, 3 belonged to the French. One of these British boats, the Wakeful, was sunk by a German torpedo. Again, names are never stated in this movie, but it wouldn't be a surprise if Nolan drew inspiration from the Wakeful's watery fate. Our 3 protagonists manage to escape the sinking ship, but aren't able to climb aboard the nearest escape boat, manned by Cillian Murphy's nameless soldier. They're left with no other choice but to swim back to shore. Historians claim that this did in fact happen. Over 200 ships were sunk in total, both military and civilian. Soldiers who jumped ship were often abandoned in the water, and those that survived would usually find themselves back on the beach. Understandably, soldiers who found themselves in this position became disillusioned and desperate. In the film, we see a soldier strip himself of his gear and casually wander into the tide, his fate unknown. Sadly, this is most likely based in fact, as there have been a few reports from the beach of soldiers doing this very thing. Eventually, Alex, Tommy, and Gibson join a passing squad of soldiers, who plan to commandeer a beached boat and use it to get off the island when the tide rises. While hiding in the hull, Germans begin shooting at the ship for target practice, and tensions really start to flare when the men suspect Gibson of being a German spy.
This one. He's a German spy. Don't be daft.
Once their presence inside the ship becomes known, the Germans open fire mercilessly. With the tide coming in, the men are barely able to make it off the beach. But it isn't long before, once again, the ship goes down. While Tommy and Alex and the others manage to escape, Gibson unfortunately perishes. The men, now covered in oil from the minesweeper that took out their ship, are in danger of being set ablaze, as a downed bomber is heading directly for them. Miraculously, a civilian boat comes upon their downed ship and manages to rescue some of them in the nick of time, but many are left to perish in the fiery waters. This sequence of events, starting with the commandeered trawler and ending with the daring rescue, are all dramatic creations just like the characters. However, like Nolan has said, situations like this were a very real occurrence during this operation. Just because the film doesn't pull directly from very specific instances, it doesn't dampen the truth of the larger picture, making it difficult to rate these scenes on the factometer. The civilians who rescue Tommy, Alex, and the other soldiers at the conclusion of The Mole are the center of their own storyline, The Sea, which focuses on the civilian effort. In The Sea, we follow Captain Dawson and his son Peter, played by Mark Rylance and Tom Glenn Carney, respectively. They're also joined by Dawson's teenage hand George, played by Barry Keoghan, who joins them at the last minute. The men set sail for Dunkirk, and along the way rescue Cillian Murphy's nameless soldier from the Mole, now shell-shocked from the prior night's attack. Once on board, the soldier argues with Dawson and demands they turn the ship around and return to England. Tensions escalate and the soldier inadvertently knocks George down the cabin stairs. The teen eventually succumbs to the wounds suffered from the fall. This sequence in the film is one of only a few plot threads that doesn't seem directly drawn from real life. Not only is George a fictional character, so are the injuries that he suffers. Captain Dawson and Peter also manage to help a downed British RAF pilot, Colin, played by Jack Lowden. This sequence, where Collins almost drowns due to his cockpit not opening, is heavily dramatized in that the rescue happens just in time. But there are numerous reports of civilian ships pulling down pilots from the English Channel. The same can be said for the climactic rescue involving the soldiers from the Mole. The sequence is dramatized, but daring rescues like this were a big reason why the evacuation was as successful as it was. Collins, the pilot rescued by Dawson in the sea, is part of the film's third and final storyline, The Air. His partner in The Air is Tom Hardy's Farrier, and this plot thread features some of the most thrilling aerial sequences ever put to film. Let's start with the hardware. Nolan opted to use actual functioning Spitfire planes from World War II for the intense dogfight sequences. Cameras were mounted to the planes, and every aerial sequence was filmed in the sky without the aid of CGI. The actors were actually in the air, reacting in real time to the sharp maneuvers. For these scenes, Nolan and his crew utilized look-alike Yak-52s, a two-seater aircraft from the Soviet era. The real pilot controlled the plane from the back cockpit, hidden from view. The interiors were also redesigned to make them indiscernible from the Spitfires. For the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 planes, of which none exist today, Nolan had his team develop painstakingly accurate life-size models, which were remote-controlled by operators on the ground. The only noticeable difference between the replicas and the real planes is their paint job. In the film, the German planes are featured with a yellow nose. In reality, these planes weren't painted like this until a month after Dunkirk, but Nolan opted to include it for the sake of visual clarity, and it made it easier to distinguish the German and British planes during the intense dogfight sequences. Furthermore, the subtext of this story thread, 1 hour, is in reference to the amount of gasoline the pilots were allotted. In order to ration supplies, the RAF were forced to conserve fuel, and thus were only allowed an hour's worth of it. This is, unsurprisingly, true. The dogfights depicted in the film were quite common during the evac. Although planes couldn't do much to help the soldiers stranded on the beach, they could do their best to defend them from the skies, and battles often played out in the clouds, unbeknownst to the soldiers on the ground. However, the film takes some dramatic liberties towards the end when Farrier, completely out of gas, glides over the beach and takes out an enemy plane before it bombs the ships and soldiers stranded along the mole. Now, some may find issue with how long Farrier was able to glide through the air without fuel, but unsurprisingly, veterans claim to have flown over 15 miles without any fuel. So while this didn't happen at Dunkirk, it's certainly within the realm of possibility for a British Spitfire plane. The less than accurate aspect of this sequence is the plane's proximity to the beach. In reality, the planes flew too high to be visible, and often far off the coast as well, so none of the soldiers at Dunkirk actually saw any friendly planes in the sky. Hence the comment at the end of the movie from the soldier demanding to know where Collins and his fellow pilots were when they were being attacked. And of course, the bit where Farrier shoots down the dive bomber while gliding is probably the most inaccurate scene in the whole movie, although it's certainly thrilling. The air ends with Farrier landing on the beach and setting his plane ablaze before surrendering to encroaching German soldiers. Again, though this scene is fictional, there is truth to it, as 1 in 7 Allied soldiers at Dunkirk were captured by German forces and made prisoners of war. The film's closing shot shows Tommy and Alex, safe back in England, taking the train home. While Tommy reads Churchill's famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, around them, British citizens welcome them home, seemingly unfazed by the war taking place just across the channel. An accurate depiction of the war climate in Britain at the time, but it wouldn't be long before Germany would bring the war home to them. While Dunkirk is very accurate, it isn't perfect. The biggest issue many historians have with Nolan's film is its lack of scale, as contradictory as that may sound. Due to Nolan's propensity to rely almost entirely on practical effects, it was incredibly difficult for him to visually show the gargantuan undertaking this entire mission was. For example, there were over 400,000 soldiers stranded on the beach, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a shot in the film where there were more than 4,000 soldiers. This would have been a difficult task even with the aid of CGI, but Nolan's reluctance to use it severely limited the true scope of the event. 2007's Atonement features another stunning recreation of the Dunkirk beach, and is arguably more in line with reality. Furthermore, Nolan focuses solely on 3, but mainly 2, RAF pilots, when in reality there were hundreds flying in the sky. Obviously, it was a smart decision to narrow the focus to Farrier and Collins in regard to storytelling, but the total absence of the Spitfires in the sky isn't totally accurate. Finally, historians have taken issue with Nolan's omissions from the film. Outside of one very brief moment in the beginning of the film, Nolan doesn't address the thousands of French soldiers who defended the beach from German troops. Their courageous actions were not addressed in the film to any degree, when the success of the mission heavily depended on their ability to fend off approaching German soldiers. But one could argue that including another story thread may have overwhelmed the film. Some have also taken issue with the exclusion of certain minority regiments that were at Dunkirk, such as the Royal Indian Service Corps, as well as squads from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. However, these soldiers would have numbered in the hundreds compared to the hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers. So while their inclusion may have been notable, the fact that they aren't shown in the film isn't necessarily a historical inaccuracy. There's only so much that you can include, and Nolan clearly had a very focused story that he wanted to tell. So there you have it, the truth behind Dunkirk. Unsurprisingly, Nolan's film is not only a technical achievement in every sense of the word, but also thrillingly realized and, perhaps unsurprisingly, incredibly accurate. With the exception of some dramatized roles and omissions, most likely for the sake of time and focus, Nolan has managed to make one of the most historically accurate war films of all time, despite it being populated by fictional characters. For all of these reasons, it's safe to say that Dunkirk is more fact than fiction.